Welcome everybody who is here already. We are just going to wait for 2 or 3 minutes for any latecomers to arrive. In the meantime, there is a poll which should have appeared on your screen, so please do fill that in and provide us with information about what sort of organisation you're with, and I will return to you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, so I think we'll probably make a start now. Thank you, whoever's in charge of the slides, and thank you to those who filled in the survey there. So welcome to this webinar on democratizing access to finance for green and social enterprises in the Pacific and Caribbean. It's great to have you all here. My name is Owen Dowsett, and I'm a senior consultant at the British Council, specifically within its Global Social Enterprise Programme. I'm based in the UK. From a list of people who had registered for this event that I saw earlier today, we potentially have attendees from Bahamas, from Comoros, from Vanuatu, from Maldives, so lots of islands out there, which is fantastic, as well as lots of countries on the continent and landlocked countries. So wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. It's really fantastic to have you all here, and we're really looking forward to a super discussion today. Now, I know this may be a new platform for many of you that we are using to deliver this, so please do familiarise yourself a little bit with the control panel that you should have on your screens. That is where you will be able to post any questions that you might have, and there will be an opportunity for panel members to respond to some of those questions a little bit later in the event today. I should also highlight that this session is being recorded, so there will be an opportunity if you want to watch back the recording or pass it on to friends and colleagues, then there will be an opportunity to do that. The other thing that I should say is that there may also be links, useful links that are posted in the chat section of the panel, and these might include websites that are referred to and organisations that are referred to, as well as the ICR facility itself, which this is a part of, and you will hear a little bit more about in due course. Now, I would like to invite to give welcome remarks to fantastic people who represent the facility, both from the EU side of things and from the African, Caribbean and Pacific side of things. So given that you're on camera, Escipion, I would like to invite you first to give some welcome remarks. This is Escipion Joaquim Oliveira Gomez, who is Assistant Secretary General of the Department of Structural Economic Transformation and Trade for the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. So welcome, Escipion.
Thank you very much, Owen. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like really to start by saying Bula to all my friends and colleagues in the Pacific and the Caribbean. We really like to thank the ICR facility for this seminar. We do believe that the themes that we're going to touch today are of the utmost importance. I think social finance, green investments are really the future, especially for people like us, island people. Of course, the Caribbean is not only islands. We do have Guyana, Suriname, Belize, etc. But in one way or another, we also consider ourselves islands, even in those countries. So We are very open people. I think that the themes are going to discuss today are of the utmost importance. And I really want to thank the European Union, which has been our long-standing partner, because with the European Union, we are working towards a framework to help the private sector from our countries to be able to compete in a globalized world. And we are very happy to be joined in this adventure by ICR, of course, GIZ, the German Ministry of Cooperation, the British Council, Expertise France, and SMV, who have really put together a very good group of experts that you will see today with this exchange, but it goes much deeper than that. And we look forward really to exchange with you in the seminar. For those that don't know the OECPS, which I believe is the best kept secret in the development world, the OECPS is the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. We became an international organization last year, and we evolved from the ACP group. We regroup 79 beautiful, the 79 most beautiful countries of the world. We are led by His Excellency, Mr. George Rebelo Pinto Chicote, who is our Secretary General. He's from Angola, and he's very committed really in promoting the sustainable development of our countries and the guideline integration into the world economy, with the ultimate objective really to reducing and eventually eradicating poverty. All of our work together with the European Union is to look for a better living for our people, and this particular seminar is going to touch themes that should help to promote that. In our quest for development, youth and women empowerment are at the center of everything we do. I think that I don't want to take a lot of time in my introduction, but I really look forward to the discussions today. Not only this is a seminar, but the idea is to have the involvement of the private sector and of regional organizations in this debate. With the European Union, we're launching what we call the ACP Business Forum or ACPS Business Forum that will seek really to promote as much as possible the involvement of the private sector in helping us define your needs and putting programs at your service. For the Caribbean and for the Pacific, we have regional focal points for the private sector. In the Caribbean is Caribbean Export, where I had the privilege to work before, and the Caribbean Association of Chambers of Commerce, CARICHAM. For the Pacific is the Pacific Island Forum, which is a very good partner of ours, and PIPSO, the Pacific Island Private Sector Organization. So to all, thank you very much. And Vinaka Vakalevu, thank you, what good. Now
Fantastic.
we pass to the older person in the, we exchange, we started with you first, and now Mr. Miguel Campos, which is my senior by many, many years, is going to speak now.
Fantastic, thank you, Escipion. And yes, indeed, if I could now just invite Miguel Campo Lopez to speak. He's policy officer within the Directorate General for the EU Commission.
Thank you, Owen, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you. I won't take much more of your time. I think it's important that you have the opportunity to listen to the experts. Just to say that as Escipion was saying, this is the result of a strong commitment between the OECPS, the European Commission, and the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the British Council to have such an instrument that provides support to ACP private sector and public sector to improve the investment climate. But also, I think it's important to highlight that the result of I mean, this webinar is the result of a big effort, and it's, I have to say, an effort mostly pushed by the OECPS to make sure that through these instruments that we have, these webinars, we actually reach the counterparts or the interested colleagues from the Caribbean and the Pacific, that sometimes because of the time difference, sometimes because of the complexity of trying to do these kind of interventions, cannot access this type of trainings, this type of access to experts and to the dialogue. And we felt from the very beginning of this instrument that it was important that we made an effort, that we had we built instruments that were available for the whole African, Caribbean, and Pacific region. And that's why we are today here to make sure that you can also engage in the discussion, enjoy from the expertise, and then maybe follow up with the ICR to request support. And on this, I want to also especially emphasize for the Pacific We have a lot of requests coming from Sub-Saharan Africa. We have a lot of requests from the Caribbean, but we have not received so many requests from the Pacific. So today I just want to share with everyone that the ICR is there for the 3 regions, and please feel free to contact us, to contact the ICR team, to see if we can support you in your efforts to improve the investment climate and the business environment. I will stop here, and happy to be here today with you and listen to the discussions. Back to you, Owen. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Miguel. And I am just going to talk very briefly about what both Scipion and Miguel have referred to, which is the Investment Climate Reform Facility. Now, this is a facility which is set up and funded under the 11th European Development Fund, under the partnership agreement between the ACP and the EU. ACP is African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, together with BMZ, the German Ministry and the British Council. And its objective is to support the countries and regional institutions in Africa, Caribbean and Pacific countries in their public-private dialogue process to create a more conducive and sustainable investment climate. And in short, it's a facility that makes available technical assistance for organizations and institutions and ministries that are involved in I guess reforming and designing and developing the business environment and the investment climate. And the form that it comes in is up to 90 days of technical assistance over up to a year period. There's certain eligibility criteria in terms of who can submit a request, but essentially we take requests from organizations which would like support in affecting their local environment and business environment. So please do get in touch if you would like any more information on that. There are a couple of links that have been put in the chat, so please do go along to the ICR facility where you can website where you can get more information on that. But I think I'll leave it there for the moment. And I would just like to highlight before I pass to the main presenter today, just like to remind us of what the event is about today, and I'm just going to essentially read from the main brief that was part of the invitation. So, in the face of mounting climate risks, entrepreneurs are coming up with solutions to accelerate the transition to more climate resilient development, alongside investors putting more resources into climate finance. The climate risks are particularly acute for small island developing states in the Pacific and the Caribbean, where there's also been a growth in entrepreneurial solutions that address both the environmental and social impact of climate change. This webinar will include climate finance and regional experts to discuss the financing needs of green and social enterprises in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and solutions to help them access investment to build greater resilience to climate change. So that's what we'll be looking at today. I am now going to pass to the consultant who has done a lot of the work around this, who is preparing 2 policy papers, who has delivered multiple webinars for us previously on this sort of topic of access to finance for social enterprises, Bonnie Chiu, who heads up the Social Investment Consultancy. So please, Bonnie, take it away. And I know I've gone a bit over time, so sorry about that.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So to set the scene for our very exciting panel discussion that will be coming up, we all know there's a very, very urgent imperative for financing climate change solutions in Caribbean and Pacific regions. So this slide contains just some of the basic statistics for us to really understand the urgency, particularly for small island and developing states, as Sion already told us about. With these states particularly sharing a number of challenges such as limited capacity to raise domestic resources, the high energy and transportation costs, high vulnerability to climate variability. So this webinar will be focused on how we can really mobilize private capital and involve the private sector to channel resources. And also we'll be looking at climate change not just as an environmental issue, but an issue that has environmental and social impact, and to also address environmental as well as social solutions that would combat climate change. So just to then zoom in a little bit, looking at impact investment, which is a growing area of finance that supports both social and environmental impact. Within the Pacific and Caribbean region, this graph shows the number of investors that are actually allocating a significant amount of capital to the region. Within Pacific Island countries, we have noted that within impact investment, there is a gap for smaller investments, particularly those that are under the ticket size of 200,000 euro. In Jamaica, just as an example, as a Caribbean state, there are lots of social enterprises, but they find ongoing reliance on grant capital as well as obtaining other forms of finance to be their biggest challenges. So that is the state of play for impact investment. At the same time, there's been a growth of climate finance. Arguably, climate finance is more focused on environmental impact, but the worlds of impact investment and climate finance are also converging more and more together as we see both the social and environmental impact of these issues. Here, this slide just talks about the alignment between climate finance and impact investment in Pacific countries. On the right, we have listed the key investment areas for impact investment in Pacific Islands. Particularly in green are some of the sectors where climate change is particularly relevant for: housing, energy, food and agriculture. Looking then to the Caribbean region, we also see a huge growth in climate finance, close to $1.4 billion in climate finance between 2010 to 2015. About 6% of total reported aid flows to the region, but most of it are mainly grants and loans. And what is interesting comparing the Caribbean countries and the Pacific countries, in the Caribbean countries, we see climate finance dedicated more to addressing mitigation issues. So you see on the pie chart, 48% of climate finance has been dedicated to mitigation, whereas in the Pacific region, 59% have been dedicated to adaptation. So there is also a slight difference in terms of where the priorities are. And we think that enterprises play a huge role in both, but particularly in mitigation and more preventative measures. Here is just another, a bit more information about climate finance, the sectoral focus of climate finance in Caribbean and Pacific regions. We were trying to look in terms of research, who are benefiting from climate finance? Is it NGOs? Is it government? Is it enterprises? We actually don't have the answers to that, and I will turn to our panelists later to really hear from their perspectives. But what we do know is a sectoral focus, and the font is a bit small, I think, for you to see very clearly, but some of the main sectors such as transport and storage, renewable energy, I mean, those are also very aligned to what impact investors are looking at. So we think there's a lot of more room for impact investors to be looking more closely into climate change. Now, the next few slides, I'm just going to share national and then followed by regional and global approaches to channeling finance to green and social enterprises. So the first one, Belize is not a island state, but we thought we'll share this example because the Belize Social Investment Fund has a very, very interesting aim, which is looking at gender equitable and inclusive access to climate resilient infrastructure. So it's really looking at both the environmental and social impact of climate change. We have noticed some of the key sectors such as education, health, eco-infrastructure, water and sanitation. And this is also a good example of national governments collaborating with regional development banks as well as international multilateral institutions. The other example is the Jamaica Social Investment Fund. It was already established in 1996 as part of the poverty alleviation strategy. Again, as SBS Dowsett talked about earlier, poverty alleviation is also very linked to climate adaptation and mitigation in the cases of island states. Those are some national approaches around pooling capital to support national priorities such as climate change. There is one regional approach in the Pacific Islands, which I know our panelists from Fiji will also talk more about. This is a program funded by the Australia Aid to designed to pilot and facilitate a social impact market in the Pacific. It has a very strong focus on women's empowerment. It operates across 14 Pacific Island countries, aiming by end of next year to attract, well, actually this year, by end of this year, to attract at least $10 million of new private investment. How they are applying gender lens is mainly looking at the investment analysis and supporting investors to enhance gender equality in their investments. So that's a regional approach, and climate is one of their core focus. Finally, on a global approach, I want to highlight a relatively new initiative of the called the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. What you see on the fund structure is a slightly complicated slide, but to describe how it is leveraging on blended finance. What the Global Fund for Coral Reefs seeks to do is to fund innovative business models that increase the resilience of coral reefs and the communities that depend on them. Within small developing island states, there is a growing theme called the blue economy, not just the green economy, but also the blue economy. This fund is made up of partners, including 4 UN agencies, 2 private foundations, and 2 financial institutions. The innovation is really how it uses grants to fund some of the technical assistance, capacity development, policy, monitoring and evaluation, using grants also to provide stimulus packages. So they're looking to raise $125 million in grants. At the same time, raising an investment fund, which will provide guarantees, loans, early equity investment, lots of different types of investments to meet the different needs of green and social enterprises. In the middle, you'll see some examples of revenue generating projects that they are interested in, such as ecotourism, sustainable fisheries, blue carbon, water treatment. I'm sure we'll hear more concrete examples from our panelists as well. But this, even though this is a really innovative fund and as well as relatively early, what we do know is one of the partners is UNCDF, the UN Capital Development Fund, which has a remit focusing on least developed countries. So it's likely that a lot of the beneficiaries from this fund will be a number of the island least developed countries, such as Kiribati, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, etc. So key takeaways before passing it back to Owen to kick us off in a very exciting discussion. Enterprises that focus on both environmental and social impact are very well placed to address the social and environmental impact stemming from climate change. But to date, the fields of impact investment and climate finance have been developing relatively separately, but the last few years have really seen a convergence of the 2 fields. Particularly, we see now more innovative financing structures to ensure that climate finance is not only channeled to really big infrastructure projects, but more to enterprises, including startups and small and medium-sized enterprises. So with that, over back to you, Owen, to facilitate the panel discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bonnie. And a big thank you to Bonnie, because she's done a lot of these webinars for us and has had to pull together a lot of information that's sort of been thrown at her and is out there into some sort of sense, which is challenging to say the least. But thank you, and thank you for giving that overview. I think it's really interesting and highlights the potential role that there is at the structural level to really ensure that capital is flowing in the right direction, to the right communities, to the right sorts of enterprises. And I think increasingly globally, there's recognition that you know, there's responsibility with policymakers, with investment professionals and so on to really up the game in terms of the innovations that they kind of use and employ. So without further ado, I'd really like to engage our fantastic panel members, and how I'm going to do this is introduce each of them in turn, and just then offer them a kind of initial 5 minutes to introduce themselves and to respond to what I hope is going to be a bit of a provocative starter question. So firstly, I'm going to introduce Dr. Buriata Eti Tofinga. She is a university researcher and lecturer at the University of South Pacific and based in Fiji. She taught entrepreneurship, management and strategy courses and has had published work on social entrepreneurship and the management of social enterprises in the Pacific. And it's really, really great to have you here, Buriata, because I think that sort of Pacific perspective is very much needed in this facility and within the sort of forums globally that sort of talk around this. And as well as introducing yourself and maybe talking a little bit about the experience that you bring to this, it would be great if you could just briefly reflect, and this is a question I'll put to other panel members as well, on this provocative question, I guess, which is, do you think entrepreneurs that are addressing climate and social challenges in the Pacific area that you know about are receiving the financial support they need? So with that, I'll allow you to introduce yourself a little bit more and maybe touch on that question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Owen. And hello, everyone. Bula, Mary, and greetings from the Pacific. So I might ask you again, Owen, to repeat the question back to me, but I'll just quickly introduce myself and my background in working in social entrepreneurship and social enterprise since 2010. And this was when this idea of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship was new and unpopular as a movement or way of doing business in the Pacific. And so I just wanted to share that information that I initially take on interest working with social enterprises in Australia when I was a researcher at the University of Sydney Business School. And I worked with a few social enterprises in New South Wales. One of them is a social enterprise that produced recycled organic products. These are the products that are made from organic or green waste, like leaves, grass clippings, things that can be composted. And so they used to produce organic compost to farmers in the area where I was working with a social enterprise. So this is something that I wanted to share as in my experience, because it has something to do with what I'm going to say about the Pacific and my perspective of how social enterprise and social entrepreneurship at the moment is had in the Pacific. And so my work with that social enterprise actually inspired me to ask this question, you know, if we have these kind of business models and social enterprise business models in Australia, working for rural agricultural communities, why can't we have the same in the Pacific? Why can't we have these kind of business models also in the Pacific? So that kind of inspired me to ask questions. How can we translate these business models in the Pacific context? So the question that I was asked, Owen, may I ask if you can repeat the question?
Yes, of course. It was just a little provocation, really, which is just to reflect on, do you think that social entrepreneurs and enterprises in the Pacific Islands that are addressing climate and social challenges, are they currently receiving the financial support that they need?
Yes, so my direct response to that question, I would say they don't have specifically funding tailored for their social enterprise. So the source of finance that they might have access to is provided through the traditional sources of finance, like banks and development banks. So they can go, if they want to start a business, they go and take out a loan in the banks. So those are the options that they might have as entrepreneurs. And whatever idea that they have as a business, but is it for green social or social enterprise, they're still eligible to those traditional finance options. But specifically for social enterprise or green enterprise, they have limited options for financing, where they can get this source of finance. They have plenty of ideas. You cannot run out of business ideas, right? And here in the Pacific, we are training entrepreneurs. So we're encouraging Pacific Islanders to become entrepreneurs. So we have trainings delivered by governments on green entrepreneurship in partnership with, for example, the Green Global Growth Institute. They're also running training programs on how to start a green enterprise, and there are also other social entrepreneurship training modules delivered. So what we have here, we're creating a group of people, entrepreneurs, but matching that number with the financial options that they have out there in the Pacific is, I think that's going to be a problem because it's limited at the moment for them. And their option is to go to the bank and development banks to seek for that funding. So yes, I would say my response directly is it's limited, all right? Options for them to finance their social enterprise and green enterprise if they have the idea and to kickstart their startup. Yes, that could be my response to that particular question.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Mariata, and what a great opening sort of summary to get us going on this, because I think that's probably a challenge which is echoed across social enterprise and social entrepreneurship communities around the world, and I guess it's not too surprising to expect that that's also the issue in the Pacific Islands. Yeah, is there something you wanted to add?
Yes, I also would like to add on the, I think Bonnie mentioned about Pacific rights or Pacific readiness for social investment in social enterprise. It's an Australian government initiative. It's been going on since 2016. I think what they're doing is they're pioneering an initiative to promote social enterprises to investors. So they have their own pool of investors. They have access to, they're trying to match their interest with social enterprises and entrepreneurs in the Pacific. But they have a very specific approach. They use a gender lens approach, meaning that they focus on social enterprises that are specifically led by women or managed by women for the benefit of women, to support women. All right, so it's very much gender-based, and that's an appropriate approach in the Pacific, given that you know very well women in the Pacific, they are vulnerable, and like in any other societies, they're still vulnerable to all sorts of disadvantage, violence, you name it. They tend to have limited opportunities. So in the Pacific, that was, I think, it was an ideal approach to have in the Pacific. And since it's a pioneering initiative, I think what's important is that Pacific Rise provide a model for other investment platforms to follow and learn from it. And so if you want to have more information about this Pacific Rise initiative, you can go online and the website. They have communicated much of their progress and success stories on their website. So you can actually see how they're supporting financing social enterprises, specifically for the benefit of women in the Pacific.
That's fantastic.
Yes, that's what I would like to add.
Thank you very, very much, Mariata. That's great. And maybe somebody could put into the chat to the audience the link for that Pacific Rise program. That would be really, really useful, because I think that is a lot of that is the purpose of this ICR facility as well, to really kind of share the learning that kind of congregates around these sort of pilot schemes and these initiatives, because I think a lot of it's relevant elsewhere. Thank you, Mariata. We'll come back to you shortly. I think if you look in the chat, there's probably going to be 1 or 2 questions that are going to be directed to you from the audience, so give you time to prepare. Okay, thank you, Mariata. Now, secondly, I would like to, I'm sort of going in reverse here in terms of what's on the slide. I would like to introduce Mr. Patrick Longmire, who is Managing Director at SEAF. He is in charge of the firm's global climate and energy investments. He has over 25 years of experience in energy finance in the United States, Latin America, and Africa, with leading firms including Castalia, the IFC, Emerging Markets Partnership, Lehman Brothers, and Chase Manhattan Bank. So Patrick, if you're able to come on camera and unmic yourself, it would be great to take a similar approach, maybe speak a little bit about the experience that you bring to the table on these topics, and then if you're able to address the similar question from the countries that you've worked in about whether social and green entrepreneurs have access to the finance they need, then that would be fantastic as well. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Owen, for the invitation and the time to speak here. I'll keep my background very brief so we can get to the core of the subject. I've been working in energy finance for 25 plus years, most of it recently in clean energy, which is obviously climate related one way or another. My experience includes a lot of work in the US, a lot of work in the Caribbean, a lot of work in Africa as well. Most recently, I'm now a managing director with CIF. CIF is a global impact private equity fund management company. We have about 40 plus funds in 33 different countries, all focusing on agribusiness, SMEs, women's empowerment. So everything sort of double bottom line, social impact, and commercial returns. Most recently, we raised a fund about a year ago to invest in SMEs in the Caribbean. That fund is sector agnostic, so we are looking for clean energy investments in that sector. So that's my background very briefly. I do want to get to the question there about whether entrepreneurs in the Caribbean get the financial support that they need, and it's really my experience almost day to day is really looking at that question, and the answer is it sort of depends, right? For big projects, there's plenty of money. If you're developing a utility scale project in the Caribbean, you will get very attractive financing from the DFIs, from large IPPs, so that's not really an issue. But from my perspective, when you talk about climate issues in the Caribbean, it should not be climate mitigation. Again, the Caribbean can go 100% green and have almost no impact on global climate, nor for that matter even on the impacts locally within the Caribbean in terms of climate change, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of the extreme weather events. Mitigation is not really the story here. So when Bonnie pointed out that the bulk of the investment has gone in the Caribbean has gone towards mitigation projects, those are all the big utility scale projects that I guess are all fine and good, make people feel good, but and for that matter are cheaper, so they have a huge positive impact on the Caribbean in terms of cost of energy, in terms of self-reliance, in terms of stability of energy costs, in terms of foreign exchange reserves. So they all have a huge positive impact, but they're not really climate related in their own way. The climate adaptation part of it is really going to be more distributed generation in the Caribbean. And I think that is where entrepreneurs there do not get the financial support that they need. As Boryata said, their sources of finance tend to be the local banks, let's say, maybe local investors, but it's primarily local banks. And those local banks are not comfortable with the risks and with the issues and with the promise, for that matter, of clean energy distributed generation or energy efficiency projects. And so the banks approach it from a very commercial perspective, which is, I need collateral, I need, projected cash flows that are ironclad, which really aren't readily available for smaller projects. So the way forward, the way to solve this problem is to somehow match these huge piles of capital for clean energy projects that are available overseas and match those with the entrepreneurs within those countries. The problem that I have a pile of money, would love to do that. My problem is that the projects that are in that area, sort of distributed generation, tend to be small. And so transaction costs, the problem with the Caribbean is that not only do you have small economies, which limit the size of the opportunity within each country, but also small projects, and that becomes very difficult from a transaction cost perspective. And so the answer, I guess, to the question ultimately is, are entrepreneurs getting financing? It depends. Yes, but not really.
I love those answers. Thank you so much, Patrick. That is fascinating, really fascinating. And I think that's kind of a purpose of this this webinar, really. I think we've focused, as various people have said, quite a lot on sub-Saharan Africa and the situation there in terms of social entrepreneurship and enterprise and access to finance. And I think the challenges are similar in many ways in terms of small projects and the finance not being really appropriate for that. But obviously the sectors and the kind of sort of focus of those projects is different, and it varies by community, it varies by continent, it varies between Africa and the Caribbean and the Pacific. And it's really interesting how you brought out there the kind of nuances of the particular challenge facing social entrepreneurs and the system as a whole and that relationship as a whole within the Caribbean. And please, again, there's probably going to be a question for you in the chat, so please take this opportunity to familiarize yourself with that before I return to you. But finally, and certainly not leastly, I would like to introduce Ruth Huliston, who is, let me just refer to my notes here, apologies. Ruth Huliston is a private finance lead specialist with the Inter-American Development Bank Lab based in Barbados. Her 25 years experience includes working with the IDB and EU across the Caribbean and Latin America. She has also served in the Ministries of Finance and Development Planning in several large regional projects. Ruth has been committed to creating life-changing opportunities for vulnerable people and MSMEs affected by economic, social and climate change across Latin America and the Caribbean. So a big welcome to you, Ruth. Fantastic to have you on board. And I think similar to the other two, it'd be great if you're able to introduce a little bit more about yourself and some of the stuff that you've been working on, and potentially also just address this question from your own experience about whether social and green entrepreneurs have access to the finance they need. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Owen, and thank you so much also to Budiata and to Patrick, who made some really compelling arguments, and also to Bonnie for the great presentation. So I've been working for the last 25 years plus in the Caribbean region. I'm with the IDB Lab. We're the innovation laboratory for the IDB, and our purpose is really to drive innovation for inclusion, and we do this by working alongside partners in the innovation ecosystem, and drive kind of solutions looking at especially addressing the most vulnerable who have been affected by socioeconomic and environmental factors. And we do this through a range of approaches centered around financing. So obviously we have a diverse range of financial products that we offer our private clients. And also increasingly, we're spending a lot of time focusing on building connections amongst ecosystem players within the region and globally, as well as generating and disseminating knowledge and best practice amongst our peers. So I'm really pleased to join you this evening from my perspective, and discuss a little bit this challenging question. I mean, I would say that entrepreneurs, I think both Briati and Patrick mentioned it. It kind of depends. It depends on what kind of entrepreneur you are. And I think one of the challenges that the Caribbean has, as Patrick mentioned, is the challenge of having the best fit. We have finance. If you're a blue chip company and you're looking for a large investment, the commercial banks are falling over themselves to try and get you as their clients, because they're highly liquid and they're very risk averse. So they're looking for that kind of client. But you know, we know that for entrepreneurs to really succeed, it's important to have, you know, a sophisticated, diversified financial system that offers a range of different financial products that, you know, fits the needs of individual profiles of businesses. And we also know that in the Caribbean region, consistently and persistently, Caribbean firms report that access to finance is the most substantial challenge and pressing issue that constrains their growth. And you know, I think what is important and what's interesting is to kind of unpack this a little bit. And you know, from the perspective of the experience we have across the Innovation Lab, we really sort of come to appreciate that there are two sort of key obstacles that play a role in this context, in the Caribbean context. One, that you know, there's very limited financing available for these very early stage, high risk, small ticket size entrepreneurs who have a lot of potential future promise, but they're not able to access the right kind of finance for that stage. And we would refer to this, you know, very much as a technological financial gap. It's often referred to as the technological valley of death, right? Because what entrepreneurs need at that stage is, you know, pre-seed, equity-free, mostly grant-type support in order to develop their minimal viable products and, you know, to translate an idea into a viable, potentially viable solution. And, you know, there's also angel investment in this context is a really critical factor. And what we see in the Caribbean is, you know, very limited support goes to these early stage entrepreneurs. And, you know, even though there's interest in supporting entrepreneurship, there's often a gap in this space. Accelerators and incubators and entrepreneurship hubs play a really important role in fostering the kind of mentorship and guiding entrepreneurs through their life cycle, especially at this early stage. And there's also, although a growing movement across the region, there's also kind of limited resources that you know, that arrive at the doors of these institutions. And organizations like ours are really studying how we can best kind of, you know, find new ways and innovative approaches to supporting them, and getting away from this kind of, you know, kind of vicious cycle of a 3-year project and then, you know, starting again with another 3-year project. And I know some of the panelists and Bonnie had mentioned this in some of the discussions earlier. So we really do need to, in the Caribbean context, support that very kind of early stage, that very nascent side of the ecosystem, which, you know, as I mentioned, requires a lot of flexible, high-risk investment. At the same time, you know, there's a second valley of death that we need to be very aware of for entrepreneurs, and that's more, that's at a later stage, right, the commercialization stage. So you have your minimum viable product, and what you need at this point is resources to test and validate in order to grow that product. And that's where I think some really interesting opportunities also lie in terms of equity and quasi-equity vehicles. And it's great to hear CEF is mobilizing in the Caribbean region and looking at SMEs. And, you know, we at IDB Lab are constantly looking, along with our partners, to drive solutions to bring smart capital to the table, because these are, you know, a really important component of the work that we're trying to achieve. And, you know, at the moment, the availability of resources for these opportunities, where the ticket size is slightly larger, the realization of the return is more within sight, but it's still very high risk. And so for that reason, it's, you know, it's perhaps a challenge, and has been a challenge for the more traditional commercial banks. So perhaps I'll leave it there and suggest that, you know, in response to the question, I think the answer is no. the finance for entrepreneurs is from my perspective in the Caribbean region is far too limited. It's not the best fit for the right investment needs to grow these entrepreneurs in these segments. So look forward to discussing more of it as we go along. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Ruth. And I think everybody's sort of brought something really useful to the table here. And it's interesting how we've kind of touched a little bit upon the kind of size of projects and enterprises being a bit of an issue. We've talked a little bit about the sector of the projects and enterprises being an issue. And I think there you really kind of brought in the sort of trajectory which a lot of these enterprises and entrepreneurs tend to follow, and how that can be an issue, especially at sort of two key moments. And I think the valley of death is, yes, certainly something that we've kind of heard a lot about, but interesting how you sort of picked out those two very significant phases at the very early stage when we really need to be sort of developing ideas, ideation stage, I guess, and then further down the line when these things are ready to be put out there, to be tested, to be validated. And I think there's a key challenge here in encouraging investors, encouraging policymakers to see the value at aggregate level, I guess, to kind of tailor their investment products more to the needs of such businesses at those stages. Now, I'm aware of time, and I would really like to get at least a couple of questions from the audience to our panel members. Maybe one to return to Buriata. I don't know, hopefully you've seen this in the chat that we have behind the scenes, Buriata, but there's a question from somebody which is, how would you assess the access to social finance for women and youth in the Pacific? So there's a particular question, I guess the implication there is, are there particular challenges that face women and youth social entrepreneurs and green entrepreneurs in the Pacific, and do you have a view on that? It'd be great to hear your view, Buriata. Hopefully you're still here.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Owen. I just saw the question. Thank you for whoever asked this question. Very important question, yes. How do we assess the access to social finance for women and youth? I think what you're looking at here is the options. When you look at women in the Pacific, where they're operating their businesses, and most of them they're starting micro businesses, right? So they're starting small micro businesses, then moving on to small business, trying to grow and struggling to do that, to grow to that stage of their business. But I think at the moment, how do we assess access? How do we know? I think that I'm trying to understand the question. You're trying to ask, how do we know if women have access to social finance, right? That's probably what, and including young people. How do we know that they have access to this? Well, this is something we do in the research. For my research, I'm trying to look at creating a database for social enterprises that are started off by young people and also by women. I'm also looking at what are the kind of social enterprises, and if they call themselves social enterprise, that's another issue, right? Because if we're going to ask them, do you know if your business is a social enterprise? And then if they don't know that yet, it's another issue to look at. So I think it's a challenging question to give you a response. To be honest, to give you a direct response on this, how do we know? From my perspective as a researcher, I actually go out and talk to these women. All right, I go out and talk to these women. Do you have access to these options? How do you finance these micro businesses and trying to grow into a small business? And some of the stories that I've heard from my conversations with women, they actually got their own, small cash or small capital they started off with. And for women, talking about women in a Pacific context, they don't control the finances in the household. And so they rely on their husband. It could be their husband who have the sources of finance or controlling the finance. And then if they have that, a good relationship, they can be supported by their husband to start off this businesses themselves. And like I said, if these women have to start off with a business themselves, they have to go to traditional banks, traditional sources of finance, like banks. And again, the issue is, has been mentioned by Patrick before, there are a set of requirements from the banks. You know, the project has to be bankable. There are requirements, there are risk involved in how they're going to make sure that there's a return on that investment. So I think it's a challenging question that you're asking right here. But my response to it is that, how do we know if women and young people have access to social finance? From my perspective, is through research, going out there and talking with them, asking them that direct question: where do they get their finance from? How do they start off this business in financing it in the first place? And most of the stories that I mentioned comes from their own personal relationship with their family and friends. They can provide that kind of small capital. It's a small capital, so because at the moment there are limited options, as I mentioned, for financing this kind of social enterprises as a startup. Yes.
Thank you, Briata. Thank you very much. That's great. I think the question maybe is also getting at, like, what is the problem in access to capital for women, and I would like to just highlight that this is an aspect that was explored a little bit in the first policy paper that was produced by the ICR Facility in this series on access to finance. So please do, whoever asked that question, take a look at that, which explores whether women face particular challenges as social entrepreneurs in accessing to finance. And I think a lot of the time that's dependent on norms within a country, and whether there's any sort of systematic disadvantage which prevents and presents particular challenges for women in accessing finance. Now, I'm very aware of time, and I would really like to end on the hour if at all possible, but I do just want to give Patrick and Ruth one opportunity to come back. I will also say that there have been a few questions asked, and we'll make sure that they're addressed in the policy paper, or we can encourage panel members to submit an email response if that might be helpful, and if they're prepared to do that as well. But I think just to finish off, I think Patrick and Ruth, if there was one thing that you would suggest being changed at the kind of system level to address some of those problems that you've talked about in terms of access to finance, then maybe you could sum up in just 1 or 2 sentences. I know I'm being ambitious, but Patrick, let me invite you to do that first.
Yes, let me give 2 sentences. The first, from a policy perspective, is to try to harmonize policies amongst the different countries, so that investors don't need to do research and legal due diligence on each separate market individually. And the secondly would be, as far as any grant financing, grants tend to focus on helping entrepreneurs early stage of development. I think a better grant idea would be to subsidize transaction costs, basically to pay investors to go through due diligence, maybe, you know, obviously on a shared basis, but somehow to subsidize at the cost of due diligence, so that we can access smaller transactions.
Fantastic, thank you. That's the kind of innovation we need, I think. And Ruth?
Well, perhaps what I would suggest is that we should focus on results and get away a little bit from, you know, the fiduciary and the financial aspects, and start looking at some of the impact. And, you know, if we can finance institutions because they achieve, entrepreneurs because they achieve the intended impact that you know they're developing and they're aiming to arrive at with their solution, then I think they should be financed according to their results. And we're doing a lot of experimental work, and we have over the years with you know, contingent recovery, investment grants, and other kind of flexible sort of blended finance operations, where we're focusing the we're focusing the dialogue around the impact and around the results, and that's how the funds move. And I think that would be a really important way to continue working.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, and I know that there have been some sort of innovative financial instruments which aren't simply payment by results, sort of social impact bonds, as they're sometimes called, but kind of relate interest on loans to certain results being achieved, and as a proportion of revenue and things like that in terms of scaling of social enterprises. And it's useful in my eyes to sort of link those two things together. That is fantastic. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to give more time to talk about some of these topics, but I am keen to just keep this within an hour, and I'm aware that we're getting quite late for a lot of people, and other people are just starting the working day. So I'm going to draw it to a close now. A massive thank you to all our panel members, and I just want to highlight as well that on the back of this webinar there is the opportunity to request some one-on-one support from the team at the Social Investment Consultancy who delivered that presentation earlier. This is for certain eligible organisations, which is on your slide at the moment. These are targeted virtual individual support sessions on some of the themes today. Eligibility is for public or private organisations based in an African, Caribbean or Pacific country, and there's some examples of some of the clinics on your screen at the moment. The idea with these and with the sorts of organisations that we would support is very much that they're in a position to affect the business environment, the investment climate at a sort of ecosystem level. So please keep that in mind if you're thinking of requesting support. And please do get in touch if there's anybody that you want to be put in contact with, or there's any sort of further information that you would like to hear about some of the things that you've heard today. There's a list on the screen as well of upcoming activities being delivered by the ICR Facility. 2 more webinars, I understand, and keep your eye out for a policy paper as well on some of the themes that you've heard about today. And without further ado, I think we will leave it there. Thank you to all our panel members. Thank you to Bonnie. Thank you to Miguel and Decipion for your welcoming remarks. And thank you finally to all of the people who attended today. We hope you found it useful. And please, just before you go, fill in this final feedback form so we can improve if necessary for the future.